Thanks very much, Nancy. You also have one of our other members here from Post Polio Network. It's Linda Wilkins. She's also a polio survivor. So welcome to Linda. I'd like to be able to share my screen. I put a couple of notes into a PowerPoint. Am I able to do that? That's okay.
Yeah. You see it at the bottom there, Wes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Oh, there we are. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I did something right. That's awesome. So post polio syndrome, that's what we're talking about today. We're still here. People who contracted polio, and many of them, half or more, develop what's known as post polio syndrome. So polio for short, obviously, many of the people here, judging by their age, will know of polio. About 90 to 95% of people who get the virus are asymptomatic. They have minor symptoms and they pass, and some it's just like a flu, and others it's, they get a fever and short-term paralysis, but they recover from that. Paralytic polio affects about 1%. In Winnipeg, it was kind of interesting. I read an article recently shared with me by somebody in California, but it was a PhD article that was done on polio in Winnipeg. And she said, besides having the highest incidence per 100,000 of anywhere in Canada, we were over 340 in Winnipeg, and places like Ontario were about 13 per 100. And about half of the people that had polio in Winnipeg develop paralysis of some sort, so much more than normal. Paralytic polio comes in a couple of forms, and we're both represented here today. Spinal polio affects nerves in the spinal column, causes paralysis in the limbs or the rib cage. More often affects one side of the body. So when I grew up, I thought it only affected my left leg. I mean my right leg. That's my left leg now. Bulbar polio affects the nerves in the brainstem, and it causes difficulties in breathing. And if any of you have seen pictures from the 50s, you'll have seen people in iron lungs, and that is because they had bulbar polio. Some people get both bulbar and the spinal column, so they have problems with the diaphragm, controlling breathing, and requiring a ventilator to breathe. One person from Regina that shared some information here with me, he went for 40 years after having polio with really no issues, and at the age of 40 had to start using a trach, and now he's on the trach 24/7. So that's the kind of thing that can happen with post-polio syndrome. Some with the paralytic polio, they get a full recovery, but they're left with weakness on one side of the body. For me, it was my right leg, and mostly. And I'm going to just show you a couple of quick slides that'll show you how the macro movements that you see, like when I do this, everything looks okay, but I may be able to do this with only 70% of the muscles working. And as we age, we all lose some of that. And if you only started with 70%, pretty soon you can get below the threshold where you can do this kind of stuff. For me, from going from arm wrestling Blue Bomber football players in the 70s and beating them, I now have difficulty lifting a cup of coffee. So that shows you how things can change as you start to lose the compensatory mechanisms that developed after you initially had the virus. So this is kind of a slide. It looks busy, but it's pretty simple. Basically, when polio affects your spinal neurons, there are connections between each one and various muscle fibers. You either have neurons that were unaffected, they were completely killed, or they were somewhat damaged. So after, as you recover, the neurons that weren't damaged at all will say, I can help you out. So instead of pulling 3 or 4 wagons, maybe I can pull 20 wagons. So I'll put a little shoot out to adjacent fibers that have lost their neuron, and I'll help them out. And with the damaged neurons, they also reconnect to a point, and they can function to a point. So as soon as you get enough fibers working, you can do things that makes it look like you've recovered in that muscle group. And for many people, they were good their whole life. Some I've met as early as 70 when they started to have post-polio symptoms, and they went from downhill skiing and cross-country skiing to needing a wheelchair and a scooter. So it's quite dramatic in some people. So these kinds of symptoms reoccur 15 to 40, even 70 years after. And these nerve sprouts that provided the recovery, they start to break down, and returning paralysis and weakness back to what it was originally. So I've learned that what's going on in my body, especially in the last year, is returning me to what I was like immediately after the virus. And I'll apologize for my voice. I got COVID about 3 weeks ago, and it took my voice away. And if anybody knows me, I talk a lot. And so I kind of missed being able to talk. I couldn't do meetings, and I started to get my voice back over the weekend, but every now and then it disappears. So hopefully we'll make it through. I apologize if you can't hear me. So the symptoms for post-polio, it's muscle and joint weakness, extreme fatigue. And this is what gets a lot of us, like doing our normal activities, because we don't recognize the damage that our muscle fibers are experiencing everywhere in the body. It creates a lot of fatigue, and literally I have to go to sleep. And I had to finish work 10 years early because it was affecting me at work. And the bank I worked for wouldn't find me a job that was more suitable. So I had to quit work. A number of people also have severe intolerance to cold. They develop trouble swallowing, sleep-related and other breathing problems, and they decline in their ability to walk or perform customary daily activities. So of course, one of the things that post-polio survivors are impacted with is the financial concerns trying to adapt to their living space. For me, it's been about 50,000 over the last 2 years to stay in our living space. So I was born in 52, and I was blessed with polio in July of 53. I happened to read my mother's baby book, or my baby book that my mother produced, looking for some information that CDC wanted. And I found out I had chickenpox twice in June. The second bout 2 weeks after the first bout on my birthday, and I was severely ill with chickenpox. This would kind of mean that my immune system was somewhat impacted, because I had 2 older brothers. They didn't get polio. 2 weeks later, I couldn't sit up in the crib. They called the doctor, and I was diagnosed with polio. I was not hospitalized because, as Harriet said, the hospitals in Winnipeg in 52 and 53 were overwhelmed with polio patients. Eventually, I got to the point where they had to put me in the hospital, and I was there for about 6 weeks. Growing up, I remember walking with 2 braces joined at the groin, underarm crutches. And I worked very hard, as all the polio survivors that I know, they work so hard to appear what I termed normal. I walked down the aisle of my wedding. I was worried about my brace squeaking, but I wasn't using any crutches. I walked 35 miles on crutches. I don't know if anybody remembers Miles for Millions walk, but I did complete that in 1968 on crutches. in one go. It was about 16 hours, and I paid for it for a couple of weeks. I swam competitively. Somebody discovered me just doing laps in the Pan Am pool and asked me to join the para team. So I did that and represented Canada internationally. And if you joined the Manitoba team, then you had to do everything. So that meant track and field, basketball, volleyball, you name it. If you're going to England, you're doing everything. So I also learned to ride a bike using my good leg, water ski. I worked as a hospital lab tech, walking around with my tray full of blood samples for miles. Didn't think anything of it. Didn't use my crutches. I didn't find out I had issues with my left leg till I had a skiing accident. My brothers like to get me on the whip, and I only had one ski. If any of you have water skied, you know, you got to kind of control yourself with your back foot. Well, my back foot was used to wave at people along the beach. They're wondering why it was splashing along in the water beside me. And I got a ski where you shouldn't. And well, I went to see a young doctor, and he said, your quads are only 50% developed. And I said, oh, you're crazy. That leg's 100%. He said, nope. I said, oh, that explains why I had so much trouble learning to ski, because if you've tried to ski on one ski and get out of the water, it's very difficult because you have to, you know, stand up once you're coming out of the water. Well, I learned that I had to have my leg fully extended under the water and come out standing up, because once I got up, I didn't have enough strength to stand up. I didn't know why. So then I learned. Post-polio hit me in my late 20s. I just cutting the grass, doing stuff around the yard. And I'd fall down when my foot would hit a little dip in the grass, or I'd step on a stone on the parking lot of McDonald's or something, and I'd fall down. And 1988, things are much worse. I started to fall at work, went to a polio doctor at the rehab because my doctor's mother had polio as well, so he's familiar. This is the last polio doctor we had in Winnipeg. And he laid out what was going to happen to me after they diagnosed polio, post-polio, by eliminating everything else, lots of nerve tests and strength tests. And he sat me down and said, Wes, I can tell you what your life looks like going forward. And at this time, remember, I'm not using crutches in the house. I'm not using them outside, really not using them unless I got a long ways to walk. And he said, you're going to be in a wheelchair. And I said, nope, I am not going to be in a wheelchair. So I went, we lived in LaSalle at the time, and I went walking every day. I'd walk 2 to 4 kilometers a day, and I healed myself. I went to the rehab. I found a student that was working on her master's in physio, and she did 10 stimulation of my muscles in my leg. And when that was finished, we went out to Hecla Island. I don't know if any of you have been to Hecla. They have a resort out there, a Lakeview resort. And there's a path from there out to the lighthouse. I could walk there and back with no crutches. I said, I'm healed. Ta-da. Didn't turn out to be the case. I went to Vegas in early 90s. And walked downtown from the Luxor and took the bus back, rested, came back. Out in LaSalle, we're working in the yard. I'm picking up brush. I told Gail, I got to go inside. I really feel weird. Internet was just starting, and I was 3 days in bed. I got out of bed and I started searching. I came along across polio, and that was when an internet page took like 5 minutes to load. I found this Dr. Bruno, and he described my symptoms. And I said, oh my God, that's what that doctor told me 6 or 7 years ago. I've got post-polio. Wow. Okay. Well, I dealt with it, and it left me. And I recovered from that. The late 90s, I started working at the bank. But I had numerous falls, fractures, tears, and things got substantially worse. And the last 2 years, I don't even walk around the house the last 6 months. I'm in a wheelchair, power wheelchair all the time. Power wheelchair was recommended to me in 2001 to save my energy for other things. So most of dealing with post-polio is conserve to preserve. And most polio patients are like me, and we're not very good at conserving. We want to look as normal as possible, so we fight everything. And anyways, as a polio survivor, with the lifelong impact I've had, and friends that I know have had, the changes just in the last 6 months, excuse me, they impact you a lot. Can't do anything that I'd like to do. So I get really worried. I've talked to people often about polio just being a plane ride away. And when this new case of paralytic polio showed up in New York State, and I started to do research, they have polio in the wastewater in Israel and all over New York. And I just can't imagine thousands of children having to go to the hospital again. Now they won't be on the iron lung because they use different ventilators now. But it's so easily preventable with a course of a proven vaccine and booster. And up until COVID-19, you never heard of polio in the news. And when COVID-19 came about, all of a sudden, polio came up. I was called a stupid old man on social media every time I encouraged people to get their polio vaccine. I don't know anything. And people called me all kinds of names, and they used their new forum to create issues. Polio is still endemic in Pakistan and Afghanistan. There's also new cases that have been reported of paralytic polio in Nigeria, Malawi, and the Ukraine. And with all of those countries, people are being transported around the world. Now, if you have large pockets of people that are unvaccinated because they have been misinformed, that has an opportunity to spread polio. Polio only spreads in humans. So any children and adults that haven't been vaccinated, they can get polio. And each person that has polio doesn't get paralytic polio. It's usually about 1%. So for every person that you see paralyzed, there could be 100 to 1,000 people spreading that virus. And if you happen to be one of the people that are vulnerable, you could get polio. And that concerns all of us that have had polio. And it's unfortunate that people have gained this notoriety. I refer to them as COVIDiots. And they've used their new platform to spread this misinformation and categorize all vaccines in the same boat. And it's really unfortunate that parents have missed getting the vaccination because they doubt its effectiveness, and also because just with all the closures, you couldn't get to a clinic. You couldn't go to a clinic. I had my first actual appointment with my doctor in the clinic after 2 years, just the day before I came down with COVID, actually. So polio is no longer discussed in medical schools, and you won't find physiotherapists, occupational therapists, or doctors that know anything about polio. My doctor he's a young guy. He teaches at the University of Manitoba. He knows zip about polio in his own words. He took the information I shared with him, and he said he'd read through it and know more about it the next time I saw him, which is helpful. And we have to thank Salk and Sabin, who developed the vaccines in the late 50s, and the Rotary Club. I'm so happy to speak to Rotary today, and I thank Nancy for inviting me, because the Rotary Club has been so impactful in helping distribute the vaccine around the world and eradicate it in hundreds of countries. It's so great to have the Rotary Club. Fact is, the vaccines work. and they've saved thousands of people from getting paralytic polio, and it involved vaccinating millions of children. If you're traveling to a country that has cases of polio, I recommend you go to your doctor and you get a booster shot. The normal vaccine includes 3 vaccines when children are quite young, and then another one before they're 5 or 6. You can get a booster. It's not going to hurt you if you get one. If you're traveling, I'd recommend getting it. So that's me. I'm a post-polio syndrome advocate. And this is me when I was about 8. And this is me more presently on the right-hand side. I'm there as a 15-year-old, just completed the Miles for Millions walk. And there I was a year ago with my dog, who's now passed away. And that said, I hope you've had some positive information from my presentation today. I enjoyed sharing it with you, and thank you so much. And I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Wes, for sharing your story with us. Nancy, would you like to introduce Harriet? And then after Harriet has spoken, we'll ask if there's any questions for either Wes or Harriet.
Okay. So Harriet Zaidman, we met her the other day, a few weeks ago, I guess it was now. We were out at St. Norbert at the farmer's market there. And there she was with her books. And then we saw Second Chances. And I should have a copy of it right in front of me, but I don't. Anyway, Harriet will show us to us. Anyway, we were chatting away with Harriet. And then I thought, wow, we've got Wes coming. Maybe we could get Harriet coming because she can give another perspective from what the story she's written. So, and I'm very pleased to say that her novel, Second Chances, won an award recently called the Jeffrey Bilson Award for Historical Fiction for Young People. And she's very, very pleased. And I just want to read one comment from one of the jurors before Harriet starts. It says, a must read on polio awareness, adjusting to disability, the importance of vaccines for protection against disease, the dangers of misinformation, the devaluation of Métis lives. Zaidman's superbly researched novel offers teens an essential and timely story of forgiveness, personal transformation, authentic inner growth, and renewal that can come from facing a hardship head on. So Harriet, what would you like to tell us?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm so glad we bumped into each other. You came to my table at St. Norbert. Going there, I just go there, not to any other markets, but it's been very interesting to meet so many different kinds of people, and I bump into people who tell me about their polio stories. It's been pretty enlightening, and so thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Phyllis for sending me the link. It's interesting what Wes has just said. I was born in April 1952, and I didn't get polio. I just met some people, a man who lived 6 blocks away from me at the most. He and a couple other kids on his block got polio. Like it was just such a serendipitous thing that whether or not you got polio. And so I was just lucky that I didn't get polio in the 1953 epidemic. I wrote this book, Second Chances. I'm a writer. I was a teacher librarian for my career in a kindergarten to grade 8 school. So you're interested in children's literature. And I've done a couple other books. And when I retired, I began to write novels. So this novel is my second. It came about because after I had written my first one, which is on the general strike, the 1919 general strike in Winnipeg, I used some stories from my family, because my family, some members took part. There was color, how people lived at that time. And a woman asked me, she said, should I write down my memoirs, my memories of my dad, because he had polio before I was born, but how it affected us as a family. Her father his name was Dr. Percy Barsky. He became a pediatrician because of the need he saw when he was in the hospital. He was 21 when he got it. It moved him to study medicine, and he was a pediatrician in West Kildonan and the North End in the 50s to the 80s. He died in 1989, probably a post-polio syndrome, because he did apparently push himself quite a bit. Anyway, after I was we talked, I just thought, what was it like to have your life upended like that? And what if you were a hockey player? You went from complete ability, skill, and prospect, because in those days, it was the ordinary kid who was playing on the back rink who became the NHL star. You didn't go to hockey schools in those days. So this boy has potential, and suddenly he gets polio. And so that's where the story began. And he recovered. He's sent to the King George Hospital. He's in the iron lung for a bit. And when he's in the hospital, he's attracted to a girl who is struggling with polio, a slow recovery. But she's not only dealing with polio, she's dealing with racism. She's Métis. Her family lives in Roostertown, which is now where the Grant Park Shopping Center and the Grant Park High School is. And I did not know anything about Roostertown until a feature was printed in the Free Press in 2016. It was a Métis community. The Métis were discriminated against and couldn't get, it's the history of the Métis is one of from being part of the founders of Manitoba to being excluded. And so people sort of squatted on that land and built their houses there. There were about 250 people at its height. And the city provided them no services, so life was more challenging for them. But people worked, and it was a community. But developers had their eye on that property, and they did take it over. They evicted people. And so I put a girl there who's not only struggling with polio, but the fact that her family is being threatened with displacement. And so her aspirations, her family, everything is a worrisome thing for her. And she faces discrimination within the hospital as well. And all this turned out well, I could say, in the sense that I was writing for young adults, so there is you have to have second chance. You give everybody a second chance, and so it turns out differently. It doesn't necessarily turn out the same, but everybody gets a second chance. And even people who are the racists, they get a second chance. There is an opportunity for them to turn themselves around. So I was very lucky in the sense that there's so many memoirs that people have written about this traumatic time in their young lives. So I read them, and I linked up with post-polio people in the post-polio network. I talked to a lot of people, and then I met one family from the Métis community of Roostertown who told me their story and trusted me to represent it and vetted it, and they thought I did a good job. So I was very lucky, and to be shortlisted for this the Jeffrey Bilson Award, which I was, and then to win, it was an immense honor, just an immense honor. But then to win it was like, blew me away. That was last week, and so I'm still sort of on cloud 9. So I've learned a lot, and I'm certainly an advocate for vaccines, for common sense, for science, for the advancement of society in that way, and on the issue of racism, I'm equally passionate about reconciliation and good things for society. So that's me, and just to say thank you for having me. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Wes?